Every generation looks back at the one before it and assumes they knew less. That assumption falls apart the moment you look closely at what disgusting ancient habits were actually doing. What looks like filth from the outside was, in most cases, a working system, tested against death for thousands of years until it became second nature. And once you understand the science behind it, the word disgusting starts to feel less like an insult and more like a compliment nobody meant to give. Start with something your stomach probably just reacted to. Fermented meat. The smell alone would send most modern people running out of the room. But across Arctic cultures, deliberately burying meat and fish underground to ferment for weeks, sometimes months, wasn't carelessness. It was preservation technology, developed in a place with almost no other option. There were no crops to fall back on through the long winters, no easy way to keep food fresh, and no room for error when a bad batch could mean starvation. So people learned through trial and consequence exactly how long to let something ferment before it became dangerous instead of edible. The process breaks down tough proteins into something the body can absorb far more easily, while simultaneously creating an environment hostile to the pathogens that actually cause food poisoning. Why does any of that matter to you, sitting comfortably with a refrigerator down the hall? Because the foods you already crave, aged cheese, cured salami, fermented hot sauce, sourdough starter, all run on the exact same biological principle your ancestors discovered without a single lab instrument. Your palate still remembers a survival skill it never had to learn firsthand. Then there's sunscreen, except theirs came from an animal, not a plastic bottle. Rendered fat from seals, whales, or land mammals was smeared directly onto exposed skin across multiple cultures living in extreme sun, wind, and cold, from Arctic hunters to peoples along parts of the African coast. It looks greasy and pointless from a modern chair with air conditioning running. It wasn't. A layer of fat blocks wind, traps body heat against the skin, and physically shields it from ultraviolet exposure, and many groups mixed that fat with ochre or plant extracts for an added mineral barrier, essentially building a two-ingredient sunscreen out of whatever the land provided. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski, who has spent much of her career studying how human skin pigmentation evolved in response to sunlight exposure, has documented just how tightly our protective instincts are tied to the specific environments our ancestors survived in. That instinct never actually left you. It just moved from animal fat into a tube with an SPF number printed on the side. Now picture mud, thick, wet, and deliberately rubbed into bare skin from head to toe. On the surface, it looks like the opposite of clean. It's actually one of the oldest insect defenses on record, and it isn't even unique to humans. Elephants do it, wild boars do it, rhinos do it, and early humans living in insect-heavy regions did it too, because a hardened crust of dried mud is nearly impossible for biting insects to get through. In a world without antihistamines, repellent spray, or modern medicine, a mosquito bite wasn't a minor annoyance you'd forget about by dinner. It was a potential entry point for disease that could end a life within days. So a mud bath wasn't dirt for its own sake. It was armor, applied with intention, reapplied as it dried and cracked, and treated with the same seriousness you'd treat a locked door at night. Charcoal tells a similar story, and this one hasn't actually disappeared from the modern world. It's just been relabeled. Activated charcoal is still used in emergency medicine today because its porous structure binds to toxins and pulls them out of the digestive system before the body has a chance to absorb them. Long before anyone understood the underlying chemistry, ancient people across multiple continents chewed charred wood or drank charcoal mixed with water to settle their stomachs after eating something questionable. That wasn't superstition dressed up as medicine. It was pattern recognition sharpened over countless repeated experiences, refined generation after generation until it worked reliably enough that people trusted it with their lives. Somewhere in that long chain of trial and error, someone noticed that the people who chewed the black, bitter wood recovered, and the ones who didn't sometimes didn't. And then there's the discovery that quietly reshaped how researchers think about ancient medicine altogether. Anthropologist George Armelagos studied skeletal remains from ancient Nubia in what is now Sudan and found measurable levels of tetracycline, a genuine antibiotic compound still used in modern medicine, embedded directly in bones nearly 2,000 years old. The source traced back to their beer, brewed using a method that inadvertently cultivated the very bacteria responsible for producing that antibiotic during fermentation. The dosage levels found in the bones were consistent enough across the population to suggest this wasn't accidental exposure from a single bad batch. It looked deliberate, repeated, almost systematic. Somewhere in ancient Nubia, an entire community had functionally discovered antibiotics, with nothing resembling a microscope, a petri dish, or a germ theory of disease anywhere in sight. They just knew that the beer made from a certain process kept people healthier, and that was reason enough to keep making it that way. The pattern goes even deeper than our own species, which is where this story gets genuinely strange. Archaeologist Karen Hardy examined dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up on teeth over a lifetime, taken from Neanderthal remains, and found traces of medicinal plants preserved directly inside it, including yarrow and chamomile, both compounds recognized today for their anti-inflammatory properties. These weren't stray food particles that happened to get stuck between teeth. The concentration, the selection of specifically bitter, non-nutritious plants, and the consistency across multiple individuals pointed toward intentional use rather than accidental ingestion. An entirely different human species, one usually portrayed in textbooks as crude, brutish, and driven purely by instinct, appears to have practiced something close to early pharmacology, choosing specific plants for specific effects long before anyone wrote a single word down. There's another layer to this that rarely gets mentioned, and it might be the most important one. None of these practices survived because one genius figured them out and wrote a manual. They survived because they were taught physically hands-on from elder to child over and over in a world with no written language to fall back on. A child watching a parent bury meat underground wasn't reading a recipe. They were absorbing a survival protocol through repetition, correction, and consequence. The same way you might learn to ride a bike, except the stakes were closer to life and death than a skinned knee. That's part of why these habits look so strange to us now. We're used to knowledge traveling through books, videos, and search engines. Theirs traveled through bodies, through watching someone's hands work the fat into a hide or grind the ochre into powder, until the motion itself became memory. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose lifestyles still echo those ancient patterns, have documented exactly this kind of transmission, where a piece of practical knowledge is refined slightly by every generation that inherits it. Like a recipe passed down so many times, nobody remembers who invented it, only that it works. So if fermented meat, animal fat, mud, charcoal, and antibiotic beer all sound like separate, unrelated habits, look again because they share the exact same origin story. None of this was dirt for the sake of dirt. It was accumulated knowledge, refined the hardest way a species can refine anything, through direct consequence. The people who fermented the wrong batch, applied the wrong remedy, wandered into the wrong mud pit thinking it wouldn't matter, or trusted the wrong shelter during a long illness, simply didn't survive long enough to pass their mistakes forward. Everything that did get passed forward, generation after generation, had already been tested against the only judge that has ever truly mattered to a species trying to last, staying alive long enough to raise the next one. That's really the part worth sitting with. We tend to imagine ancient life as chaotic and reactive, a constant scramble with no method behind it. But methods like these don't appear by accident, and they definitely don't survive by accident. A habit has to work consistently across dozens of unpredictable situations before an entire community adopts it and teaches it to their children as simply the way things are done. That's not folklore, that's applied science. Running on observation instead of instrumentation, refined over timescales so long that a single human lifetime barely registers as a data point. So the next time something about the ancient past strikes you as primitive, backward, or flatly disgusting, look twice before you dismiss it. Somewhere underneath that gut reaction is very likely a system built by people who had no margin for error, no safety net, no emergency room down the street, and absolutely no room left over for guesswork that didn't work. What looked disgusting on the surface was, underneath all of it, some of the most rigorous science our species ever quietly practiced, one generation at a time, until it became something we now do without even noticing we're doing it. And maybe that's the real twist buried in all of this. The line we draw between primitive and advanced has less to do with intelligence and more to do with tools. Strip away the refrigerators, the pharmacies, and the SPF-rated bottles, and you're left with the same basic problem every human has always faced: staying alive long enough to matter. Judged by that standard, the people who fermented meat with precision, engineered sunscreen from fat, armored themselves in mud, medicated with charcoal, and brewed antibiotics into their beer weren't behind us at all. In the ways that counted most, they were simply solving the same problems we still face today, just with different tools, and honestly, not that much less success.